In this section, I'm going to introduce you to the Black Death, or bubonic plague. The pathogen that causes the bubonic plague is Yersinia pestis. It's a bacterium. We call it a gram-negative bacterium because it has two membranes. And it has a bacillus shape, so it is rod-shaped. Plague has been around for thousands and thousands of years, but the bacteria that causes plague was not identified until 1894. How do we as humans get plague? Well, humans get plague when infected rats or other rodents are fed on by fleas. These fleas can then feed on humans and transmit the disease. Plague did not become common in people until people started congregating in settlements and cities. Otherwise, people didn't usually live very close to one another. And it's when people live close to one another, that's what really attracts rodents. So we didn't have a lot of contact with rodents or their fleas until we all started living together. There are two common plague life cycles. The first is the sylvatic or the natural life cycle. In this case, the natural life cycle of plague is that a rodent will be infected, bitten by a flea. That flea will bite another rodent, which will be bitten by another flea, which will bite another rodent, and just keeps the cycle going and going. Once humans especially started congregating, we ended up with this urban cycle where rodents could be bitten by a flea, which would bite another rodent, which would be bitten by another flea, which could eventually bite a person. More rarely, you can have direct contact between a rodent and a person, or between a rodent and a rodent to potentially transmit disease. But you see here that that's considered to be rare, especially rodent to rodent is considered rare. Rodent to person, direct contact is usually occasional. The typical route is through the bite of a flea. And that's when we see patients get the bubonic plague. In some patients, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, the bubonic plague can turn into what's called pneumonic plague, where it gets into the lungs. When it gets into the lungs, it can then be spread person to person without the flea as an intermediate. So bubonic plague is characterized by enlarged and tender lymph nodes. We call them buboes. You can also have fever, chills, and neurologic complications that lead to what we call prostration, where basically you lay prostrate, you can't really move very well because of the infection. If the bacteria spread beyond the lymph nodes and get into the rest of the body, you get septicemic plague, where again you have the fever, the chills, the neurologic complications, but you also can begin to get shock or bleeding into the skin and other organs. This is why the disease was called the Black Death. When your blood vessels start leaking blood into your tissues, that can cause your tissues to turn black. That infection in the extremities can lead to tissue death, which can also cause the skin to turn black. So that's why it's called the Black Death. In some patients, when the bacteria gets into the bloodstream, it can go to the lungs and cause the pneumonic plague, cough, difficulty breathing, rapid shock, and death. And the problem with pneumonic plague is if one person has pneumonic plague and they start coughing and spreading it through that respiratory pathway, the other patients will go straight to pneumonic plague instead of bubonic plague. So it can be very dangerous if pneumonic plague takes hold in a population. So symptoms of bubonic plague can include bloody nose, swelling in the groin or armpit where you have lymph nodes. Those are called buboes. So here they're showing some of these buboes. The buboes will spread, and you can have them in other locations throughout the body. And eventually you can get the purple spots like shown here, or shown here in the extremities, leading to hemorrhaging, and that's why it was called the Black Death. Throughout history, there have been a number of pandemics, which means worldwide infection, or epidemic, which means kind of a localized infection, that are either known or suspected to be caused by Yersinia pestis. We already talked a little bit about the Justinian plague. There's also been the Black Death, which was in the 1300s, thought to have wiped out like at least a quarter to a third of the population of Europe. The Great Plague of London in the 1600s, and there was a pandemic in the 1800s. So this is a drawing from a manuscript from the 1300s, and you can see that one of the treatments was to lance the buboes. I don't know how effective that necessarily was, because it could introduce more infection, or it could introduce the bacteria into the rest of the body, but that was one of the treatments at the time. There were so many people that died of plague that they didn't have much to do with the bodies, and so when the bodies had decomposed enough, all of the bones were left over to create these ossuaries, these really elaborate displays of the bones. The Black Death in the 1300s came from the East because of black rats that were found on trade ships. It peaked during the 1340s and 1350s and estimated to have killed anywhere from 30 to 60% of the European population. It's really hard to know for sure because they didn't have accurate census records like we have now. There were lots of people who lived kind of quote unquote off the grid. So that's why there's such a big gap between the low and high end of the estimate. This was also one of the earliest recorded instances of biowarfare. Mongols would, when they were trying to invade an area, take plague corpses and catapult them over castle walls. So castles really served as a type of defense because everybody could hide behind the castle walls and be protected until the plague corpses were flung in there and spread plague throughout the castle. What we're looking at here is the spread. So it's thought to have come, at least the epidemic in the 1300s is thought to have come from Central Asia on trade ships. And you can see that first it hit Constantinople, or Istanbul, and then it spread throughout other ports, Alexandria, Cairo, Tunis, parts of Italy, and as time progressed, it just went farther and farther and farther until it finally got into some of these colder climates. What did doctors do at the time? Well, one of the first things you had to do was figure out who was responsible. And one of the things that people to this day like to do is if somebody is different, they are responsible for whatever is bad. So at the time in Europe, the people who were considered to be different were Jews, Romani, lepers, foreigners. So basically anybody who wasn't you, who was different from you, was responsible for the plague. And thousands of people belonging to these groups were either killed or imprisoned. Other options, because it was thought to be caused maybe by bad air, you could smell herbs that were clean and maybe that would kind of protect you from the bad air. Or you could do kind of bad air versus bad air. If you lived in the sewers, maybe the two bad airs would cancel each other out. Of course, you could pray. That would be another option. Turn to religion. And everybody's favorite, you could bathe in urine or stuff the buboes with feces because that could help clear the infection too. You can't see it, but I'm rolling my eyes. That obviously did not clear the infection, but that was what people tried to do. Scientists for a long time were not entirely certain about what actually caused the Black Death. Finally, after a lot of analysis of corpses known to have died during the Black Death, scientists were able to amplify some DNA that belonged to Yersinia pestis. And so that gave the confirmation that Yersinia pestis was the cause of the Black Death. Researchers have also looked at different strains of Yersinia pestis to determine how related they are to one another. And by looking at that, they can also make predictions about what strains might still be out there in nature. And so some of the data that they've analyzed suggests that there could be strains of plague that we as humans have not seen yet because they're still hiding in rodents. And if they enter the human population, they may or may not be worse than the strains that we have already seen.